Okay, hello, welcome back. Thanks for that, Will. My name's Joe, and we're going to be looking at Flame Premium here, under the guise of Fuel Your Creativity. Pretty exciting stuff. We're going to be looking at the same commercial that Will was just looking at, actually, the piece done by Brand New School out in LA. I'm just going to play this back, and then we're going to come back and we're going to break down some of the things that the guys had to do to kind of get this commercial completed.
The manual toothbrush you are using is 5,000-year-old technology. It was first used in the 36th century BC, before some other useful technologies, like writing and law, and remains essentially unchanged through time. Your manual toothbrush is still just a stick, with some bristles on the end of it. Meanwhile, you've adopted technology at an exponential rate, improving your life through efficiency, speed, and power, and surrounding yourself with every adornment of science and innovation, except when it comes to your teeth. It's time for you to leap this technology gap and end the manual brushing era. Welcome to the new level of clean. Philips Sonicare delivers more brushstrokes in 2 minutes than a manual can do in 1 month, and up to 5 times the plaque removal. Stick with technology. Philips Sonicare.
There we have it. Look after your teeth, kids. So basically, what we're going to look at here is a couple of different things. So if I just play this back whilst I talk about this, on the left-hand side here we've got the master. On the right-hand side here we've got the previs, which was actually done in Maya. And the idea is to really just kind of get a context behind how many sort of problems there were with regard to this piece as a sort of a VFX project. You can see almost straight away from the previs against the master that there were huge differences in the timings and exactly what they were trying to achieve. And you can see that as we go through here, there were going to be problems that were going to arise all over the place. Now, what we want to do is I'm actually going to try and break this down into 3 bits. I mean, first and foremost, you've got to kind of say this is a great piece of work. It's, you know, it really is quite a sort of VFX undertaking. And it's great that we've got this footage to actually use. But what I'm going to try and do is break it into some bits that we can then just show and sort of break down. And what I really want to get over is exactly why Flame is so important to this kind of creative process. It does give us a bunch of tools, a bunch of workflows, but also the power and the speed to kind of do these things very, very quickly. And it makes the creative process significantly easier and a lot more fluid. So what I want to do here is you kind of get an idea with this as to exactly what we're kind of going on about. And if I just stop there, we're going to look at this, like I say, in 3 kind of ways. The first problem that I want to address is really the problem behind the sort of integration with the CG pipeline. So there's a couple of problems in here to start with. And that is how do you sort of previs a single plate like this that's meant to actually be a continuous walkthrough. So if you actually think of this shot, this commercial, it was actually 10 different shots all bolted together into one seamless continuation. Now, at the front end, there's no way you would know that, right? Now, what we want to do is I'm actually going to look at one particular shot in here. And the shot we're going to look at is this one up here, sorry. If we just grab this into here. The shot we're going to look at is this one here. Now, the reason for that is because if you actually look, the way the guys got around a lot of the problems were to actually use things like doors, to cut between shots, okay? Or they used, there's another door here. They also used a curtain here. And this basically gets us through our transition points. Now, the reason I want to look at this shot is because actually this was probably the hardest shot because they don't have that. So what they actually had to do is they had to create their own takeover point. So you see here we go from a medieval courtyard into a Victorian station platform. And that's very hard to do without an obvious takeover point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a couple of ways that we could have got around this problem. And what's kind of ingenious about this is where Flame comes into this and really kind of helps you out in terms of a bunch of things. So here's the initial shot, the courtyard. And what I've done is I've really just done a very basic, pretty crude dissolve right into the sort of incoming sort of platform scene, if you like. And really, you know, that's not going to fool anyone. That's not really what we're going to try and do here. But the idea is that composition is all about just kind of making it so that your eye isn't drawn to the anomalies in the scene. So what we want to do is start utilizing the power of the flame. Now, in this version, in 2014, what we've done is we've actually brought the batch to the timeline. And this is a massive leap forward for us in terms of what we can do, because it gives us one integrated render engine, but it also gives us the creative abilities of things like action and stuff like that on the desktop. If I jump into the action node here, now I'm not actually going to do this track, I'll do one in a second, but you get the idea of what I've actually done is I've used the Flames 3D tracker to actually get me out of a problem here and track through the dissolve, okay? Now this isn't something that really, by all rights, it should do, but it does, okay? And the great thing about that is it gives me one continuous camera move. Now the points themselves aren't going to be of any use to me because we do have a differentiation in the pixels, but what will be of use is the ability to actually just use the camera and feed that out, and you can see in there what we actually get is one consistent camera move, okay? If I come down into here and I actually go into the camera and we go to the export, I can now stick that out to Maya as an FBX, and they will have all that metadata that I've generated in the Flame. So what this does is it gives us a way of actually integrating the two bits of software. We have a post-production pipeline, therefore, that involves CG on one side and sort of 3D compositing on the other. Now, what's great about that is if I come into batch here, you can see what they gave back as a concept from Maya was to give me kind of a 3D walkthrough. And what that means is that in here, I now have an FBX that will literally sort of mimic that entire scene. So you get your cave with your caveman in it. You get the closing doors of the kind of Caesarean period. And in here, you've got the kind of other bits and pieces, the station and the medieval courtyard. What's also really nice, and again, this is about how the two systems integrate, is that here's the FBX that I was given back. But what they also did is they actually gave me a whole bunch of plates that were already placed in the scene that were constructed as part of the 3D fly-through. And what's nice about this is I can actually go through, and if I hide those, I'll just going to unhide these as we go through. So something in here, you'll see that suddenly my character pops in there, because I've actually just got a still and I've mapped him onto a plate in the background. But again, because it's part of the 3D track, what it's going to do is if I start unhiding a few more of these, you'll see that now they sit in space of that 3D. What's also really nice in here is if I come up to this over here, and I unhide this. This is a lens flare. Now, I'm just going to stick this in because, well, I'm a sucker for a lens flare, but also it gives me a good opportunity to show you what you can do with Flame in terms of the 3D capabilities. And you can see as the door closes there, it actually closes on the 3D lens flare as well. And you can see this is proper 3D, right? Because as we come through, it is parallaxing as we move backwards. So this is a kind of really nice way of looking at these. And again, this is really just a starting point to get between the problems of how do you sort of work with CG and Flame all in one context. So if we come back to the desktop for the moment, and I'm just going to clear this out. Now, there's a couple of other problems. Mainly, the foreground is one of them, and without wanting to sound too funny, the background is the other one. So where we're going to start with this is really in the foreground. Now, there's a couple of things that we want to do here. If you look down here, if you think about the foreground and what was happening, right? So the guy is morphing from one character to another, but also he's sort of getting dressed and clothes are flying off him and all this other kind of stuff. So that was actually a combination of a whole bunch of different things. We've got some sort of physical elements in here, which include things like waistcoats or these sort of toga-esque scarves, things like that. But we've also got a whole bunch of EXRs and things in here, which again, because of the 16-bit nature of our timeline, I can actually use those on the timeline now in the correct aspect and the correct image data. So what I'm going to do, though, is we're going to look at something a little bit different. In here, I've got a bare-chested guy, and the idea is we're going to dress him as we go through. I decided that it was probably better not to just recreate a setup that they'd already made, but actually to look at the tools that would allow us to do that. So in here, I've got this guy's face. He has got a clean face, but he's got clothes on. What we actually want is this guy's body, but the different face, right? So this is going to be a kind of challenge in a couple of different ways. Now, again, first and foremost, what we're going to do is we're going to use the timeline. Now, the timeline really gives us an editorial context for all of this VFX work. And this is something that is very, very important when you're doing something that requires a lot of retiming. And that's exactly what this is over here. If I jump back to the front, what we're going to do is I'm just going to drop the other guy on top of him for the moment. So we'll do something like so. Again, you can see how easy it is to kind of do that in here. What you can see is in there at the moment, obviously, we have an issue, as you can see straight away. One guy's hunched over, one guy's standing up straight. Their arms are in totally different positions. Their faces are in totally different positions. But I can't actually see them in context until I turn this little thing on here called the comp node. Now, the comp node is a new a new button in here, and it allows us really now to just sort of very quickly, amongst other things, just view these two guys in context of one another. Now we can use it for a whole bunch of other stuff. There's blend modes and pre-multiplication and stuff like that in there, but for the moment, I just want to look at it in terms of an editorial context, and this is a really nice way that I can use to sort of time things against each other, use time warps, things like that. Now, for the moment, if I just reset that, what I can also do from here, and again, this is a really nice feature, is we can just come out here and add a mat. And so what that's basically going to do, as long as we make sure that this is unpre-multiplied, what we can actually have in there is now one over the other. Now, again, we can just see the context in which they're in. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select both of those, and we're going to promote those up into batch effects. And again, the important bit to remember here is that this is batch. So if you think about it in a different way, the timeline here is really just a kind of a different implementation of the batch environment, okay? So if we come out to here and I go create batch effect, what it's actually going to do is it's just going to expose those nodes, okay? Now, this puts it in a procedural composition environment. And whilst that is a lot of words, what it basically means is that I can now do effects, okay? So in here, I've now got this guy, but he's now in context of my scene. So I can sort of say, well, let's make this X amount of frames. And now what we're going to do is, well, first and foremost, we're going to start dressing him. If I come into here, and I'm going to feed him into the background, and what we're going to have in here is now the ability to start sort of bringing in some of those elements that are going to start dressing him. Now, I've actually done this whereby, as any self-respecting flame guy would, he doesn't want to be rotoscoping, right? So in here, I've got a guy next door in Flare who's just doing the work for me. So I can bring that across. Here's the mat that they've generated for me, and literally dumped it in a shared library. And this is another really cool feature. It just allows me to share stuff between internally of a project. I can literally have someone moving things around for me externally. In here, what I can do now is I can start feeding that in to my scene, okay? So if we go into the batch and we just add a new layer here, and I'll just feed that in as a front and a mat. And you can see in here that what it's going to do is when I add it into my scene here, if we just slip this back, if I add that into my scene, what I'm going to have in here is, if I come downstream a bit, is I've now got a kind of waistcoat. I'll just turn these icons on for a second. So you can see there's a couple of problems, right? This was a waistcoat that was shot with these guys, these green-armed guys, but it was obviously shot for a torso in a position that wasn't for this guy necessarily. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of the nice kind of new features in here, and we're going to look at the problems and how to get around that. So if I come into here, and I set this to be my my object view over here. What I'm going to do is we're going to actually change this to what we call an extended bicubic. Now, an extended bicubic, for people that have used Flame before, isn't new as a concept. However, what we have now is, because what we actually have is a dual control over the extended bicubic. If I grab this and I maneuver it around, you can see what I'm doing. In fact, if I just come down to here, you can see it a bit better. I'm manipulating the image, okay? But you can see on this side, the image isn't changing. Vice versa, if I actually come into here and I do this, I'm doing exactly the same thing, but I'm doing it from a different perspective. On the left-hand side here, this is actually the UV points. This is actually the 2D representation of the texture, and this over here is our 3D implementation of it. So what that means is that I can now do some really interesting stuff between the way that these two things interact, and that's exactly what we're going to kind of do here. We're going to start quite simple, but then we're going to build into something a little bit more complicated. So for the moment, what I can do is I can subdivide. For those amongst you that have used Flame before, you can always now merge back, which is a really nice feature. You can then come to here, and we're going to say, all right, well, this will kind of get us into a position, and we're going to just kind of rotate and maneuver that around. But fundamentally, if I just put this down here, again, you can see it's not going to quite fit, but if we get it kind of close on his shoulders, then we can do the rest using the UVs. So if we come into here, hopefully you can see the differentiation in there. But rather than actually just picking this up and maneuvering it, which is also a possibility, but it does affect the integrity of my vertices, what I can actually do is over on this side, I can say, well, let's slide the texture. And now I'm not moving these points at all. I'm actually just moving the points on the left-hand side. So the integrity of the image is remaining in terms of the vertices. So this allows me sort of dual control over a lot of this stuff, and very quickly I can just come into here and I can just rearrange the UVs to kind of work in a slightly different way to maybe that they were before. This is a very simplistic kind of example, okay, but you can see that this lends itself to huge amounts of stuff, and you'll see that in a second. If we move this on a stage, obviously this is a demonstration and I've got a lot to show you, so I'm going to jump forward a couple of times here. But fundamentally, if we come to here and I just drop this down the bottom, this is the same thing, but just moved on a few stages. So if we come into here you'll see it's exactly the same thing with the guy. But what we've actually got in there is a couple of other things. You can see I've got a sort of a free-floating garbage mask in there, which is going to allow me just to hide certain bits of his of the coat, the waistcoat at certain points, so it kind of looks right. But also what I've got in there is a group. And if I ungroup this, you can see that actually I've also just timed up some other things. So if we lose the icons for a second, what we've got in there is a whole bunch of things. So we've got a shirt coming on, we've got the waistcoat, but we've also got this CG bow tie that's sort of coming on and sort of tying itself, if you like. Now, what's nice about that, and the reason I wanted to show you that, is that down here under the timing curve, because this is all in context of batch, I can very quickly just come in here and I can start retiming these things, depending if it's the shirt or if it's the bow tie or so on and so forth. And again, this is really just a case of having all of these tools at your disposal at the points when you would really need them. So you can see like this, we might decide that this is much more what it's going to look like. Now, if I come back into batch, I want to actually take this now, and I'm just going to hide all that for a second. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to address the problem of the face replace. Now, this is where we start getting a little bit more complex. If I come into here and I actually bring this guy in, I'm going to add him as just as an image to start with. So we have him here. And if I add him at the top here, you can see initially he has no mat. So I'm actually going to decide, well, I'll take out the other element of the comp. And now in there, what we've basically got is if we turn the mat on and off, you can see that we've got the guy over himself. Now, this is quite important because what we want to do is we want to isolate his face, and really to have the background, it just gives us a context. So if I come into here, and again, we split the views. This side is going to be my object view. This side is going to be my result view. And what this is going to now allow us to do is show you something slightly more complex. If I come into here, I can now select an option whereby I actually move the UVs and the vertexes simultaneously, right? So if I come into here and we make this an extended bicubic again, what's going to happen now is if we go into the UV points, I'm going to be able to very quickly isolate his face. And now you can see what's happening over here. And also, if I have the background turned off, you'll see what's happening in here. I'm actually physically cropping the image. I can use this as an explicit crop. Now, I want the background on because I want to see what I'm doing. So in here, we'll sort of do a bit of this. We'll do a bit more of this, and so on and so forth. And again, really what we're trying to do here is just isolate this part of his face. Now, this is going to be a two-stage process because actually what I need to do here is I need to isolate his face, but then I need to track him on to the background. So again, these new tools in the extended bicubic allow me to do a lot of that stuff. If I do something like that, I can then come into here and I can subdivide that. And again, I can subdivide it as many times as I want. But this will do for the moment. We're really going to just kind of try and make this as sort of a simple process as possible for the moment. We'll do something like so. If I maneuver this around, you can see that gradually I've kind of isolated his face like so. If I multiply select those now, I can come down into the UV points, and in the tracker, I can say each point and stabilize. And what that's going to do is it's going to bring me in here. Now, we might have a few problems here if we leave these points like so. This is on black, and that can sometimes cause problems and things like that. And this maybe a little bit close to his mouth because he's brushing his teeth, so there's going to be lots of kind of changing pixels. But if I come into here and we use this feature called offset reference, I can literally grab these points now and just say, well, actually, I think this point is more likely to track. This point is more likely to track. This one here is going to be tricky, so we'll just stick it on his eye. Down on his chin here, you'll probably find it's all right, but we might just want to give it a bit more definition, something like so. Again, you know, the tracker in here is very, very powerful. We probably do a lot of the work for us, but it's always worth just kind of giving ourselves the best fighting chance anyway. And in here, if we do something like so, when I come to the end, you can see actually, because I'm a donut, I've actually done it right at the end of the shot. So I can come into here and I can actually just analyze it backwards. It doesn't actually matter too much. Now you can see that pretty quickly it's gone through and it's done that pretty complex track. And what it means is when we come out of here, you can see what's happened is I've actually isolated his face. Now again, if I turn the background off, you probably can't see it all that well, but if we turn the background off, you can see what's happened is actually now, even though there's lighting changes and things like that, the tracker has done me a lot of favors there and kind of gone through and done the work for me. So what we have now is we have an interpolated stabilization, if you like. So what that means is that very quickly now I can come into here, I can remove the background, and I can feed in my other background, the thing that I actually want to track it to. If we turn that on, you can now see in context where our problem is, right? You can see that actually he moves a lot. He's at a totally different point, things like so. But what's also interesting about this, and this is this dual sort of usability thing, is you can see that this side, my vertices are stable. This side, my UV points are still moving, okay? So they're still tracked in there like they would be normally. So what we're going to do here is we're actually now going to go to the same image, which is this guy, but we're actually going to track his vertices, because now I want to take the shape and I want to put it on his face. So over here, I'm going to come into here, into the vertices, and this time I'm going to say track each point, but I'm actually going to do it on the background. And again, if we just come into here, offset reference, and now I'm just going to go for some points that I think should stabilize better. Maybe this bit here, this shot, top of his ear. We want to stay away from his mouth, remember, because it's moving a lot. And then we've got these points on his chin, which we should find will track fairly well. Again, you know, it might take a little bit of work because it's something that, you know, it's a real world job. So it may need a little bit of work, but with a bit of luck, we should be able to come in here and we should be able to analyze that. And you see that pretty quickly, again, using this offset reference is a really fantastic feature. You can just come through and you can get something like so. What that's going to mean is that in here, we now have those points from two faces tracked to each other. And you can see it goes a bit wonky at the end there, but that's all right. We can always go and sort that out later on. Now, what this means is in here, I can now use the axis to actually place them in context. So if I make this slightly transparent and we kind of move in here and we sort of maybe rotate it slightly, but you can see the point of this is that we have all these tools now to do this very kind of quite complex work very, very quickly. The fact that it's all in action does really mean that I can do loads of stuff that before would have been very difficult. Yes, we could have done this work before. We could have used the distort module. We could have used the warper. But it wouldn't have been in context of action, where now I have things like garbage masks and lighting that can always help with these things. Now, that's the other point here. So you can see that I sort of now have a face that sits on another body. Yeah, it needs a little bit of work, granted, but you get the kind of idea. What's also quite nice is that I can use this auto expand feature. So at the moment, you can see there's these sort of edges in here. But I might decide, well, actually, theoretically, it's the same guy. So I can either expand this out until I sort of think, well, yeah, that's helping with the hair. We might go to somewhere like there. Yes, all right, there's a problem here, but we can sort that out with the garbage mask. But you might also decide the opposite, whereby we might actually decide to just shrink it in a bit. Now, this is not going to work here because this guy's got spots all over his face. But if he didn't have, we'd probably get away with it, right? We could probably merge it in a slightly different way. Because he does have spots all over his face, what I need to do instead is to actually come in here. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a garbage mask. So again, if we come to this side here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a quick shape like so. Let's just make sure I'm in the right view. Hang on, bear with me. So if we come into here and make sure that this was going to draw. Okay, here we go. So if we do something like so, I can just come into here very quickly and do a pretty crude shape around him there. Now what you'll see is this guy's face will jump back. But as soon as we invert that, what we've now got in there is a shape that we can then start softening the edges on. And again, this is going to give me the ability to start coming in here and really kind of easing off these edges. And you can see if I hide the icons, exactly what it's doing there. It's just easing those edges in. It's going to make it a bit easier to kind of sort of work with like so. Now again, the problem is going to be that as soon as he moves, the garbage mask doesn't move. So we want it to move with him. And again, this is the beauty of Flame, is that you can just keep throwing in these nodes and sort of creating ways of sorting yourself out with when problems arise. So in here, we can just come into here. I can say, where's my tracker? So there's a tracker, and we can just use that. If I come to this one here, we can just say adjust offset, and what it's going to do is it's going to put it back in there. And you can see that pretty quickly we've created a fairly good face replace, considering I'm doing this kind of live and quickly. This is stuff that really does take quite a lot of jiggery pokery. Now you're all going to say, yeah, okay, but his hand doesn't work. And you'd be right, but that's a problem for a different day, not right here. So if we move that on slightly, where I'm going to finish with this is if we actually then just come into here and we unhide all the things that I've hidden, like so. What we've now got is we've got the face replace, and as long as I make the mask selectively only mask this, you'll see that we've also got the guy getting dressed and things like that. So this is kind of cool. Okay, what I can do with the batch level now is I can say in here, create a batch effect. Now, a batch effect is basically, it's like a live pre-comp. So what it's doing is it's making a clip out of the effect. And this is really smart, because what this does is it allows me over here to really very easily just grab that and save it down into my temp library. Now, what I can also do with that is very easily just come into here and I can burn it in the background. So now it's going to render whilst I carry on with my work. And if we just come to here and I feed that out of here, and we come back to my desktop, we can see that there's my effect, and we can revisit that later on. So for the moment, if I come to here, now we've sort of looked at, or we've touched upon the problem of the foreground, but actually probably the background is a bigger problem. So if I come into here and we just load this desktop up, now what we're going to look at is, as I sort of said at the beginning, this is the shot that we're actually going to kind of try to sort of break down. We've looked at a bit of the foreground, but really what I want to work on is the problem of how do you create a continuous walkthrough when you have two very disparate shots? You've got two sort of background plates that were shot on different days, different times, different cameras, different camera people, or so on and so forth. So what you basically need to do here is work out a way that this can become a continuation of what seems to be the same thing. So where we're going to start again with this is on the desktop. Now, here's the sort of sources. So you can see this is one source, and we go to the end, and then we get the guys coming in. The second source is this one here, and you can see that same sort of thing. We have these two literally with nothing else going on. So what we want to do is we want to work out a way that we can create a takeover point. Because if you think about what we're trying to do here, is I'm actually trying to get this scene into this scene as though they were walking through it. So the way we're going to do that is by starting in here, and I'm just going to make a new sequence. And with that sequence, what we're going to do is we're just going to decide on a takeover point. At what point in the edit do we go from the guy in the medieval courtyard to the guy in the station? Now, I reckon it's going to be somewhere like this, okay? Maybe when the guys are crossing the tracks. If we make a quick edit there, and I just get rid of that shot, basically what we're going to have in there, if I just make a still of that as well, because we're going to use that in a second. But fundamentally, what I've done is I've created a timeline. Now, if we come to here, and I just I split these screens. So over here, I've got my my timeline, my record view. Over here, I've got my source, which is my incoming, okay? And again, we can just use the timeline now just to bolt these together. So I'm literally going to grab this, and we're going to actually, let's just make a new track, and I'm just going to drop that in underneath, like so. Now, I know roughly where it should go, but I don't know it precisely. So this is where the comp node will come in very, very useful again. I can actually come into here. I can say, just make it a little bit sort of transparent, and I can then see exactly when the bottom image starts moving. So we can actually start rolling it into position. So I know that if I go to this shot, I go to near the end, I can actually start rolling this until we know that it's kind of moving as well. And again, you know, having this sort of the ability to use the comp node on the desktop is really quite amazing. So if I come to here, we jump to this, and I'm just going to make an edit. We're going to keep that bit, and I'm going to throw that bit. So you can see in here, like, what I've now got is the ability to just come in here, and I'm going to trim this back as well, because I don't need the whole shot. So you can see if we just come to about here, that'll do fine, because by then we're into the transition into the next shot, okay? So you've got to remember that this is a continuation of the entire commercial. We're doing one shot here, but actually this would have been a process like that went over 10 different shots. And again, where that's important is with something like flame, something like this, you would need a flame to help you get around those problems. If we come into here, I'm going to basically select this and make mark into out. And you can see what I'm going to do. So if I come back to my desktop, I can literally now come across here, and I'm just going to record in that still. Now, the point of this is that if we come to here and turn the comp node off, what I've now got is if I play this back, I've basically got this shot to my takeover point, and then we go into a still, okay? But underneath, what's actually happening is we actually have this shot going on, okay? So now what we can do is we can now utilize the fact that we have action in the timeline now, okay? So I talked about this earlier, but this is basically a whole load of timeline effects that are now using batch as its core architecture. So what that means is if I come into here and I go into my action node, you'll see that in here, in the foreground, I have the still, not particularly exciting. But in the background, I've got the moving image, okay? Now, what I can do in here, which is really nice, is I can actually select the background and create a 3D track for the background, okay? So if we come into here, I'll just set a couple of things up. I want this to be off, and I want the media to be above. If we come into the analyzer now, I'm just going to kick this off. Now, the reason is because I kind of believe in doing these things live. I like the fact that you can sort of see how quickly the 3D tracker will go through and analyze that scene, okay? And it's quite a, you know, all right, it's a fairly standard pullback, but there's a lot of stuff going on in the scene. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of let that go through. And afterwards, what we'll have is a 3D track. But not only will we have a 3D track, but we'll have it in the context of the clip that I need. If we actually look at this as a 3D track, you can see that they're all my points. They can all be utilized in a number of different ways. But for the moment, more importantly, what I've actually got in here is, as long as we look through the correct camera, what I've actually got in here is now a tracked image into the scene. Now, basically, what that means is that I've created a relationship between the two shots, starting in the timeline, but then basically feeding it into the action node. We can now very seamlessly sort of take some very basic editorial data and utilize it in the VFX kind of pipeline. So what I've got is kind of that. That'll do for the moment. I'm going to come out of the action on the desktop, and I'm going to select these two, and we're going to take it into batch with the timeline effects included. What this will do is this will promote my action effect that I've just made up into the procedural world of batch, and in there we can then start doing some other cool stuff. So in here, I've basically now still got my, my camera move. But the next part of this is I now want to create a 3D projection, because the whole point of this is that I want this to obviously move away as we come through the scene. But what I also want is for this to look like a 3D representation of the scene rather than a flat 2D plane. So how do we do that? Well, if I come into here, I'm going to jump into the keyer. I'm going to set this to be my garbage mask. And what we're going to do is very quickly, we're just going to make a new garbage mask over here. Now, initially, this is going to be very 2D. We're just going to do something like that, and I'm going to break these points. But really what I'm trying to do is just isolate what's going on in this sort of part of the screen. Now, if we were doing this properly, we would probably do multiple garbage masks at any point. You might want to cut the windows out so it had a little bit more depth and there was a bit more parallaxing going on. But again, it depends on what you want to do. Over here, I'm going to save this as a garbage mask. So it's a flat garbage mask, okay? The difference being is when I come into here now, if we just turn the mat off a second, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide this image just so it doesn't get confusing for the moment. If I come into here, into the action bin, I can now import that garbage mask, but not as a flat garbage mask. I can actually make it a 3D model. If we had a light in there, and just so you can see, at the moment it is very much 2D. It will move with the camera, obviously, because it's part of the scene and it's part of the 3D takeover. But in here, what I can also do now is in the object, I can actually go into the model that we've just brought in, and I can actually give it depth. So you can see that it's actually going from being a 2D element to a 3D element. And that is really kind of powerful, because then I can kind of move it around and we can do different things with it. Now, for the moment, it's not all that relevant to have it as a 3D model, but we can always go back and revisit that in a second if need be. I'm just going to turn the shading off. More importantly is that we actually want to come in here, and using this image that we've tracked into the scene, I want to now add that as a diffuse map. So if I come into here, you can see down the bottom here that as soon as I add that, it's now added the scene to my, my cutout. Now, obviously, I don't want it to add it like that because that looks ridiculous, but that's because the geometry is wrapping based on the UVs. But if I come to here and I tell it to be a projection, if we look through the camera that we're all looking through, what you'll see is a proper projection, right? It will actually move with the scene. But we don't actually want that. What we want is for it to go through a static camera that only records it at a single point. What that means now is that not only will that kind of go in space with everything else, but it's actually 3D. So I can do some kind of crazy stuff for that now, if need be. So if we move this on a bit, again, you know, I know I'm sort of cheating somewhat, but that's just going to have to deal with that. If we come through here and I take this one here and we feed the same sort of images in, what you'll see is I've just taken this on a stage further. So here you can see this is what I had before. I've got the cutout of my house. But if we actually come back here and we sort of, let's lose the icons for a second, and I'll just split the views. And in there, you can see that actually I've got a couple of other things. If I start unhiding these elements, you see that my scene starts rebuilding itself. And I've just done exactly the same with these as I have with the thing that I just did. You can see there's a bit of a hole in there, but that's not a massive problem. We can always go back and rectify that. If I unhide this as well, you actually get a background just so you can see what's going on. And this is kind of, you've got to remember that this is my takeover point. And as we go through here, what you can see now is actually I've created a kind of 3D projection whereby there is an obvious parallaxing in the camera. So we're actually making it look much more like a 3D scene. If I come into here and we look at this, you can see that actually what I've done is I've kind of built this up as a kind of 3D element. And again, the only reason we've really done that is to make it so that it doesn't look too flat when it's being taken over. You've got to remember there's always going to be a guy in the foreground here. So the actual quality of the projection isn't probably as important as the concept itself, okay? We need to have that parallax, otherwise no one's going to be fooled. And the last thing you really want when doing composition is to have anything that might draw the eye, okay? Because your eye is very sensitive to anomalies, and that's what that would be. If we also unhide this, again, I told you earlier, sucker for a lens flare. There's a lens flare in there now. now, and you can see, just to prove a point, that there's a kind of 3D parallax going on. As the camera moves away, we kind of get that sense of parallax as well. And again, this really kind of helps with the sense of the image overall. So you can kind of see what I've done here. It kind of makes a lot of sense, and this is exactly how the guys approached this problem. They decided that actually the 3D sort of tracking and the projection would be a great way to get them around a very sort of sticky situation. So what we actually get here is, if I move this on even further, we get to kind of the last stage of this. And bear with me, because it's good to see how this all comes to fruition. If I come into here, this is the version that the guys at Brand New School actually sort of did. So in here, what they've got is you've got the, bearing in mind you're looking inside here, there'll be a load of peripheral stuff going on, but fundamentally what you're looking at is actually what's in the middle here. And this is the shot itself. So you can see as the camera pulls back, it's still the shot, it's still the shot, it's still the shot, but at frame 315, suddenly it changes. So if we go to 315, you can see here, we still have the element as we knew it. And if you actually look, it's pretty much the same frame that I picked. If we go to frame 316, however, suddenly the projection kicks in. And actually what you've got is the same kind of idea that we were just looking at. And they've put a bit more depth in theirs, but the idea is fundamentally the same, okay? You're looking at basically a projection. Now, the reason that that's important is for a couple of different reasons. In there, it gives you a map, but it also allows us to create a Z-depth pass. And because if you go further back, because this is still flat, you see that the Z-depth pass is around the image, but it doesn't actually exist in the image. So until we actually come to one of our takeover frames, we're not actually going to get Z-depth that we can use. So in here, what I can now do is I can actually utilize that information. So if we come back into batch and I look at the depth of field node, we drop that in there. And what I'm going to do is I can now utilize internally generated Z-depth passes as well as externally generated ones. And what that's going to do is going to allow me to come into here. And very quickly, and again, I always find sort of splitting these views is really kind of useful in these contexts because it does give you an idea of what's going on. If I come into here now, I can plot different areas of this, and you'll see down on my depthograph, down at the bottom here, that as I plot different areas of the scene, that little grey line jumps around. That's because it's basically telling me where the depth is sort of altering in this scene. So over here, I can then just start maneuvering it, and you can see that if I go to that point with the yellow line, it actually puts this bit in focus. If I then start cranking up the blur, and we are going to over crank it so you can really see what's going on, you can see that now I've really got kind of the ability to go in here and start sort of messing around with that quite significantly. And again, it's all in context, so I can do this, I can sort of play around with it. I'd probably animate it over time, so as the thing gets further away, it becomes more blurred. But the idea is that what we need to do is incorporate it in the actual platform scene, and that's the last bit that I'm going to try and show you here. So what the guys were actually given, and you do sometimes feel sorry for people, but what they were actually given was this green screen. This was meant to be their takeover, and that's green screen with blue crosses on, behind a guy in blue with a guy in green next to him. Yeah, it's a long night. And basically what you've got to then kind of work out is, well, we can't really use this, so what do we do? So they came up with a kind of ingenious idea, really, and that was to kind of use these open EXRs to kind of make their own transition. So you can see here that I've actually just, I've just bolted a load of these open EXRs in, and these are proper EXRs, right? So there's no kind of, there's no messing around here. These are actually multi-channel EXRs live, so these are soft imported using a gateway node. So if they're being overwritten in the background, we could be doing versions of this that will be updating as I work with them and things like that. But fundamentally, what does an EXR mean? Well, an EXR to us means that in terms of the context of a 3D composition environment, I can now bring in a light. And with that light, I can very quickly just kind of position it, and you'll say, yeah, okay, well, that doesn't really do anything. And technically, you would be right. But if I just come in here and I throw a load of shine on this, you'll say, okay, well, that's not particularly impressive either. However, if I come down to the bottom here and we unhide this normals map, that's when it starts getting a bit more real. And you can see that in there now, what we've actually got is we've got two-dimensional images that actually represent the three-dimensional sort of lighting conditions. And again, this is, you know, you're basically doing 3D without the heavy lifting needed to do heavy-duty sort of open, without having to do sort of FBX models and things like that. So this is the beauty of EXR. We can do things like this pretty quickly. If I just hide that for a second, and I'll probably just come down here and we'll turn the shading back off, just so that we don't confuse ourselves. And in here, what I'm now going to do is just go through and build this scene up. So you get the premise. The great thing about this is that the way that they actually created the gap was to come in here and really just cut a massive hole. which I quite like. It's pretty straightforward, makes sense. But you can see now that with all that 3D tracking data that we've also assigned, that the garbage mask will work with all that 3D tracking data in context, and it will allow me now really just to kind of come through here and sort of, if we remove those, you can see that really what we've got is the end of the platform just with a massive black sort of void in it. If we come through here and we start unhiding some of the rotoscoping that took place and some of the other elements, so there's some EXR smoke, there's the dude on the bike back here, there's the photographer, there's the flashes and things like that, but there's also the luggage and so on and so forth. And again, you can see we're just gradually building this up to the point where we can actually feed in the projection in the background. So you can see that it's really blurry because I already did the Z-depth blur. But the nice thing about this is because of the way I've built it and the fact that it's come from another sort of composition downstream, I've actually got a lot of latitude in there that I can play around with, and I can still go in and reposition it. The fact of the matter is that what's quite nice about these dolly tracks, although again, it's a rotoscoping incident, you can see that actually what they give me is the ability to line these up correctly in sort of 3D, because I can actually say, well, this is roughly where it would be if we're keeping the trajectory of the camera consistent. Yes, all right, it does look a little bit sort of bolted on, and that's really only to do with how we would sort of come in here and use the sort of different elements of the garbage mask. So I could come in here and I can sort of soften off that relationship, and gradually you can see that that will blend in better and so on and so forth. The other thing you've also got to remember, and this is probably the biggest part of this, is that actually this only needs to look like a takeover. So really you've got to remember that in the foreground, you'll always have this guy, right? And the guy will always draw the attention because he is the talent, he's brushing his teeth, he's the guy you're watching. But the fundamentals are that actually without the background looking relevant, it would all fall apart. And this is why doing this kind of work is really, really quite impressive. And I think it's a very good indication of why Flame is such an important machine, because it gives you all the tools in one place to kind of do this work, but also the speed to do it kind of in front of people and all in one place. So if we come to there and we exit the BFX, that will all now sit in context of my timeline. And at any point, I can revisit that, and it will all be there to be used and to be kind of manipulated. The final part of this, not wanting to keep you all much longer because I'm talking a lot and my voice is beginning to go, but just to come back to here, this was what we did earlier. Do you remember the guy with the face and the clothes? And I put him in a temporary library because I'd sort of made a batch effect out of him. And the reason I did that was really just so I could show you the element that we have in here of versioning. So I've made this version, I show it to my client, he says, yeah, it's fine, but we also wanted to have a sort of a part where his hair would grow or something like that, okay? So what we can do with that now is we can turn it into a sequence, and we can start making versions, and we can make them really easily here on the timeline. You can see that I can just quickly drag those out. Now, we're not just making versions of the timeline itself. What we're actually doing is we're creating versions of the batch effect that I made. So in there, what we can do is very easily go back in, and the whole of the batch is still there, ready to be versioned. So in this example, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to feed this guy in here. We're going to come up here, and I'm going to just unhide this. And this was something that I already did with his hair. I kind of made a little bit of a skull cap, and we just kind of, because bearing in mind the shot that this would go into was the caveman, so part of that would have been his hair growing and things like that. So you can see, again, it needs a bit of work. I've pretty much just gone in there and grabbed it, but you get an idea of the sort of things you can do. And this is really, again, now just using these extended bicubics, but as a warper rather than sort of for head replaces or anything like that. So I hope this kind of makes sense. I know I've rattled through a lot of stuff in kind of breakneck speed, but I think it's kind of quite a good example of the sort of things you can do in Flame 2014 and where we sit with it today. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes to make this, to maneuver this onto another stage as we go forward over the next year or so. But I think for the moment, I will leave you with the final. If you have any questions, please come and grab myself or one of the other guys walking around. And yeah, thanks ever so much for listening.
The manual toothbrush you're using is 5,000-year-old technology. It was first used in the 36th century BC, before some other useful technologies, like writing and law, and remains essentially unchanged through time. Your manual toothbrush is still just a stick with some bristles on the end of it. Meanwhile, you've adopted technology at an exponential rate. improving your life through efficiency, speed, and power, and surrounding yourself with every adornment of science and innovation, except when it comes to your teeth. It's time for you to leap this technology gap and end the manual brushing era. Welcome to the new level of clean. Philips Sonicare delivers more brushstrokes in 2 minutes than a manual can do in 1 month, and up to 5 times the plaque removal. Stick with technology. Philips Sonicare.